The helicopter sat stranded on the airfield, its once mighty rotors silent under the scorching sun. Engineers surrounded it, manuals open, tools scattered across the tarmac. Each attempt to revive it ended in frustration. Nothing worked. The mission this aircraft was meant for was slipping away, and with it, the lives depending on its success. Tension grew thick. A general paced nearby, the weight of failure pressing on his shoulders. He had called in the best experts, men and women trained to handle the most advanced machines in the military arsenal. Yet even they shook their heads, admitting defeat. Then, in a moment of quiet desperation, the general remembered a name. A man long retired, almost forgotten by the new generation. He wasn't in the manuals. He wasn't in the textbooks. But he had once been the very soul of these helicopters, a veteran mechanic whose hands had saved countless missions. The general gave the order, "Find him." What happened next wasn't just about fixing a machine. It was about respect, sacrifice, and the kind of battlefield courage that doesn't fade with age. This is one of those veteran stories, an emotional military tribute to a forgotten hero who returned when the world least expected it. The airfield was unusually quiet that morning, as if the wind itself held its breath. The disabled helicopter stood in the middle of the runway, its silhouette casting a long shadow over the cracked pavement. Soldiers and technicians circled it, some whispering, some arguing, all searching for answers that refused to come. This wasn't just any helicopter. It was part of a mission critical to the safety of troops stationed miles away in a hostile region. Supplies, medical aid, and reinforcements depended on it taking flight. Every hour it sat motionless was an hour of growing danger for those men and women on the ground. The engineers had tried everything, rewiring systems, running diagnostics, stripping parts, even pulling in specialists from neighboring bases. But the bird remained stubbornly silent, its engine coughing and failing each time they attempted to start it. Manuals offered no guidance, and the younger technicians began to lose confidence. Their movements grew slower, their eyes cast downward, heavy with the unspoken thought, "We can't fix it." Nearby, General Matthews stood with arms crossed, his face carved with worry. He was a man respected for his leadership, but on this day, the lines on his forehead seemed deeper, heavier. He had witnessed battlefields, commanded thousands, and made decisions that changed lives. But now, staring at a silent machine, he felt powerless. The mission was slipping through his fingers, and the weight of soldier sacrifice loomed heavily in his mind. "This isn't just a technical problem," he muttered to himself. "It's a lifeline." Some of the younger officers, eager to prove themselves, suggested abandoning the helicopter altogether. "Sir, we can call in another bird. It'll take time, but at least we won't waste resources here." Their words carried a sharp tone, but also the inexperience of men who had never seen what delays in the field could cost. The general shook his head firmly. Every minute wasted means soldiers left exposed. This aircraft must fly. And then, almost by accident, his memory stirred. A name surfaced, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. A veteran who had once been the backbone of the helicopter units. A man who could listen to an engine the way others might listen to music and hear every hidden note of trouble. He remembered stories of how that veteran, Sergeant Thomas Hale, had brought helicopters back to life in the middle of storms, in deserts, even under enemy fire. Hale was not just a mechanic. He was one of those real war heroes whose battlefield courage came not from carrying a rifle, but from carrying knowledge. While bullets flew overhead, he had once crawled beneath a downed chopper and fixed it with nothing but his hands, giving stranded soldiers a chance to escape. He was a forgotten hero in many ways, retired, living quietly away from the spotlight. Most of the younger soldiers on this base wouldn't even know his name. General Matthews turned to his aide. "Find him," he said quietly, but with the command of a man who knew this was their only chance. "Sergeant Hale. He's retired now, but I want him here. Immediately." The aide looked startled. "Sir, with all due respect, isn't he nearly 70 years old? It's been decades since he's worked in the field." The general's gaze hardened. "Age doesn't erase brilliance. Get him here." As the order spread, Murmurs rippled across the engineers and soldiers. Some scoffed, shaking their heads. "We've got the best experts here, and he wants to bring in some old veteran." Others were more respectful but uncertain. They whispered about Hale's past, about the heroic acts that had earned him recognition long ago, though the details had faded with time. Hours later, as the sun dipped lower, a simple military truck rolled onto the airfield. Out stepped a man who looked every bit the forgotten hero he was, broad-shouldered but weathered, his uniform replaced by plain clothes, his eyes sharp despite the years etched into his face. His hair was gray, his hands scarred, but his presence carried weight. Sergeant Thomas Hale walked toward the silent helicopter as if it were an old friend he hadn't seen in years. He didn't rush, didn't fumble with manuals, didn't carry expensive tools. He simply laid a hand on the side of the aircraft, running his palm along the metal skin. The crowd of soldiers watched, some curious, some skeptical. General Matthews stepped forward, offering a salute out of pure respect. "Sergeant Hale," he said, his voice low, "I can't thank you enough for coming." The veteran returned a nod. "This bird saved lives once. If it's grounded, then it's not done with its duty yet. Let's see what she's trying to tell us." For a moment, the airfield grew silent again. The experts who had spent hours struggling now stood back, making room for the veteran. It wasn't just about fixing a helicopter anymore. It was about watching an unsung hero return to the battlefield in his own way, armed not with weapons, but with wisdom. And as Hale crouched beneath the helicopter, listening, touching, observing, something unspoken passed through the soldiers. They began to realize they weren't just witnessing a repair. They were part of an emotional storytelling moment, a living military tribute to the kind of soldier sacrifice that doesn't make headlines but changes lives. The mission wasn't saved yet. But hope, fragile, powerful hope, returned the moment that forgotten veteran touched the machine. The twilight air settled heavy over the base, the fading sun painting the helicopter in a burnt orange glow. Soldiers leaned against jeeps, engineers wiped sweat from their brows, and young officers traded uncertain glances. They had all heard stories of forgotten heroes, but most believed them to be just that, stories. And now here stood Sergeant Thomas Hale, a man from another era, crouching beside a helicopter that the best minds of the present day had failed to fix. Hale's hands moved slowly, deliberately, like a surgeon before a delicate operation. He touched the fuselage, tapped lightly on the panels, and tilted his head as though listening for something no one else could hear. The young technicians shifted uncomfortably. To them, it looked like nothing more than superstition. They had diagnostic computers, advanced manuals, and cutting-edge training, yet none of it had worked. One whispered under his breath, "What's an old veteran going to do that our systems couldn't?" But the general overheard, his voice cutting like a blade. "Show some respect. That man's soldier sacrifice is the reason you even wear that uniform today." The murmurs quieted. Hale removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, revealing arms still strong but lined with scars, marks from battles most in this generation couldn't imagine. He reached into a simple leather bag he carried, far from the sleek toolkits of modern engineers, and pulled out worn instruments. A mechanic stethoscope, a flashlight dulled with age, and a small toolkit that had traveled with him across deserts, jungles, and mountains. These tools weren't relics. They were extensions of his life. "Engines speak," Hale finally said, his voice low but steady, "but only if you're patient enough to listen." The crowd watched as he placed the stethoscope against the helicopter's engine housing and listened. He closed his eyes, tuning out everything around him. The chatter, the doubt, the weight of expectation. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the distant hum of another aircraft flying overhead. When Hale finally pulled the stethoscope away, his eyes narrowed with recognition. "This isn't a failure of parts," he said, turning toward the general. "It's a failure of rhythm. The timing's off." The engineers looked confused. "We checked the timing dozens of times. The software didn't flag anything." Hale shook his head. "Machines don't live in manuals. They breathe with experience. The system can't hear the hesitation in the cycle. But I can." He climbed into the cockpit, his hands steady as he ran them over the controls. He moved with the confidence of someone who had done this thousands of times before, every motion instinctual. The helicopter, though silent, seemed to respond to his touch, as if recognizing the return of an old friend. The younger soldiers whispered again, though now with a hint of awe. He makes it look like he knows the bird personally. And in truth, he did. Years ago, on distant battlefields, Hale had coaxed life back into helicopters under conditions that would have broken lesser men. One story resurfaced in the minds of those who knew him well. A desert mission where a helicopter had been shot down, leaving troops stranded. With enemy fire closing in, Hale had crawled under the wreck, his hands torn and bleeding, and somehow brought the machine roaring back to life. That act alone had saved dozens of soldiers, yet Hale had never spoken of it himself. He carried those heroic acts not as medals to shine but as memories to bear. Back in the present, the general watched closely. He knew this wasn't just about fixing a helicopter. It was about reminding every soldier here what battlefield courage truly looked like. Not always loud, not always in the heat of combat, but in the quiet determination of a man who refused to give up on a mission. Hours passed. Hale asked for wrenches, for fuel checks, for access panels to be removed. He worked methodically, explaining little, though once in a while he muttered to himself, "That line's too tight. She's choking here. Needs room to breathe." To the untrained ear, it sounded like rambling. But to those who listened closely, it was a kind of emotional storytelling, a dialogue between man and machine. At one point, a lieutenant approached, clearly impatient. "Sergeant Hale, with all due respect, we don't have time for trial and error. The mission is critical. We need certainty, not guesswork." Hale didn't look up. His hands stayed buried in the machinery, but his voice carried weight. "Son, when you've held dying soldiers in your arms because the bird didn't lift off in time, you learn there's no such thing as guesswork. There's only doing whatever it takes to make her fly." The words silenced the lieutenant, who stepped back, shame reddening his face. General Matthews, watching, felt something stir inside him. It wasn't just pride, it was reverence. This was a military tribute unfolding before his eyes, a reminder of the unsung heroes who built the backbone of every mission. By midnight, Hale had stripped the engine housing apart and reassembled key sections with small adjustments no one else had thought to make. His hands moved surely, without hesitation, guided by memory and instinct. When he finally climbed down, his face was smeared with grease, his shirt damp with sweat, but his eyes carried the fire of a man decades younger. "Try it now," he said simply. The engineers exchanged nervous glances, but one climbed into the cockpit and turned the ignition. For a moment, the same dreaded sputter echoed, the sound of failure. Some looked away, their hope collapsing. But then, just as quickly, the sputter steadied. The engine caught, coughed again, then roared alive with a power none had heard that day. The helicopter's rotors began to spin, slowly at first, then faster, slicing the night air with growing strength. Gasps erupted. Soldiers who had spent all day in defeat now watched in awe as the bird came alive under the veteran's touch. The young technicians couldn't hide their disbelief. He actually did it," one whispered. Hale only nodded, as though he had expected nothing less. He patted the side of the helicopter and murmured, "Told you she wasn't done." In that moment, the base erupted with a mixture of cheers and stunned silence. The general's eyes shone, not just with relief that the mission could continue, but with respect for the man before him. A forgotten hero had reminded them all what real war heroes look like. Not the ones in headlines, but the ones who serve quietly, tirelessly, and with battlefield courage that time can never erase. And though the helicopter's engine now roared with life, Hale knew the real work had only begun. Because repairing the machine was one thing, proving to everyone that sacrifice, wisdom, and respect still mattered was another. The roar of the helicopter filled the night, shaking the airfield and stirring something inside every soldier present. For hours they had watched failure pile upon failure, their hope thinning by the minute. But now, under the guidance of a forgotten veteran, the bird was alive again. Its spinning rotors seemed to slice through doubt itself, reminding everyone why they wore the uniform. Because men like Sergeant Thomas Hale had paved the way. Yet even as cheers echoed, Hale didn't smile. He stood quietly, studying the machine with the eyes of someone who knew victory could be fragile. "Engines run," he murmured, "but missions don't succeed on engines alone." General Matthews approached him, the pride in his expression undeniable. "Sergeant, you've done more tonight than any expert we called in. You've given us back this mission." Hale shook his head. "I've given you a helicopter. What you do with it, that's the mission. And those men and women out there are counting on it." The general fell silent. He recognized the humility in Hale's words. This was what made the man different from the rest. His heroic acts had never been about glory, but about soldier sacrifice, about putting lives above recognition. As final checks were run, a young pilot approached Hale. She was barely 25, her flight suit crisp, her eyes nervous but determined. "Sir," she said softly, "I've read about you. They say you once flew as crew chief in combat zones where no one else would go. Is it true?" Hale looked at her for a long moment before answering. "What's true doesn't matter. What matters is you're about to take this bird into danger. Don't fly for the story. Fly for the soldiers waiting on you." The pilot swallowed hard, but she nodded. That single exchange carried more weight than any manual, any speech. It was living wisdom, the kind that transformed fear into courage. Minutes later, the mission briefing began. Supplies had to be airlifted across hostile terrain to reach a unit pinned down in the mountains. Time was already against them. If they failed, those soldiers might not see the morning. The plan was laid out clearly, but all eyes kept drifting back to Hale. They saw in him not just a mechanic, but the embodiment of what real war heroes look like. Those who gave everything so others could keep going. As the helicopter prepared for takeoff, something unexpected happened. Hale began walking toward the aircraft. The general frowned. "Where are you going?" "I'm not letting her go without me," Hale replied simply. "Not after what I've seen. You've got a pilot who can fly, but this bird's been sick all day. She needs someone who knows her heartbeat in the air. If she falters again, I'll be there." The general hesitated. Regulations screamed against it. Hale was retired, his duty long finished. But regulations didn't save lives. Men did. And this man had earned the right to decide where he belonged. Finally, Matthews nodded. "Then you'll go." Whispers spread through the gathered soldiers. Some doubted the wisdom of sending an old man into the field. Others felt a surge of pride, recognizing this as true battlefield courage, the kind that doesn't fade with age. When Hale climbed aboard, the atmosphere shifted. The young pilot straightened her shoulders, her nerves easing. The crew felt steadier. It was as if the very presence of this forgotten hero wrapped the mission in a layer of protection. The helicopter lifted off, slicing through the night sky, its thundering rotors echoing across the base. On the ground, soldiers watched silently, a sense of reverence spreading among them. They weren't just witnessing a flight, they were witnessing a military tribute in real time. Inside the helicopter, the pilot kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, but she couldn't help glancing at Hale. He sat calm, steady, one hand resting on the bulkhead as if feeling the machine's pulse. He seemed to sense things before they happened. When the engine groaned under stress, he leaned forward, instructing quick adjustments. His instincts were sharp, unclouded by age. As the helicopter neared the mountains, the danger became real. The radio crackled with distress calls. The unit on the ground was under heavy fire, low on ammunition, their position growing desperate. The pilot's jaw tightened. Hale leaned closer. "You'll want to come in low, behind the ridge. If you approach head-on, you'll be a target before you land." The pilot hesitated. "That's not in the flight plan." "Flight plans don't save men under fire," Hale said evenly. "Trust the bird. Trust yourself. And trust that sometimes, instinct beats instruction." Something in his tone carried weight beyond argument. The pilot nodded, banking the helicopter low as tracer rounds lit up the sky in the distance. Down below, the pinned soldiers looked up in disbelief as the helicopter appeared, not from the exposed direction the enemy was watching, but from the shadow of the ridge. It was a maneuver born of experience, of lessons carved into Hale's memory decades earlier. The landing zone was chaos, gunfire, smoke, shouting, but the helicopter descended like a guardian angel. Supplies were unloaded, wounded soldiers were carried aboard, and all the while Hale kept a steady hand on the bird, listening, guiding, ensuring she didn't falter. One young soldier, bleeding and barely conscious, caught sight of him and whispered, "I thought they said you were gone, but you came back." Hale squeezed his hand briefly before the medics took him. The rescue was brief but felt eternal. When the helicopter finally lifted off again, carrying men who might not have lived another hour, the crew's hearts pounded with the gravity of what they had done. And in the cockpit, the pilot glanced at Hale, her eyes wide with admiration. "You saved them. All of them." But Hale shook his head, looking out over the dark terrain. "No. The soldiers saved each other. The bird just did her duty. That's all any of us can ask." As they flew back toward base, the silence inside the helicopter was heavy, but it wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of respect. Every person aboard knew they had been part of something larger than themselves. Back on the ground, when the helicopter landed safely, soldiers rushed forward to help unload the wounded. But their eyes kept drifting toward Hale. They didn't cheer, didn't clap. Instead, they stood straighter, some saluting, others simply bowing their heads. They knew they were standing in the presence of an unsung hero. The general stepped forward, his voice rough with emotion. "Tonight, you've reminded us all of what it means to serve. This wasn't just a mission, it was a lesson in sacrifice, courage, and honor." Hale looked at the faces around him, young, hopeful, untested, and he simply nodded. Then the lessons worth more than the mission. The night air was cool when the helicopter's blades finally slowed, their thunder fading into silence. Soldiers rushed forward to offload supplies, to carry wounded comrades, to clasp each other's shoulders in relief. The mission had succeeded, and lives had been saved. But as the chaos settled, every pair of eyes seemed to drift back to the man who had made it possible. Sergeant Thomas Hale stood quietly beside the bird, his hand resting on the worn fuselage. To him, it wasn't triumph or glory, it was duty. Yet the men and women around him felt something more. They had witnessed battlefield courage in its purest form, not loud or boastful, but steady, unyielding, and profoundly human. General Matthews approached, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped just a few feet away, then saluted, an officer honoring a retired sergeant. The gesture stunned the younger soldiers. Rank often defined respect, but here, respect had transcended rank entirely. "Sergeant Hale," the general said, his voice tight with emotion, "you came when we had no hope left. You gave us more than a working machine, you gave us back our faith." Hale returned the salute slowly, his hand trembling slightly with age. "General, all I did was what any soldier would do. Make sure the mission could go on. That's what we're here for. Nothing more, nothing less." But to the soldiers watching, it was much more. They saw in him what the textbooks never captured. The soul of service, the weight of sacrifice, the spirit of unsung heroes who had quietly carried generations forward. Word spread quickly across the base. Soldiers who hadn't even been near the helicopter that night came searching for Hale, eager to shake his hand, to hear his stories, to stand in the presence of someone who embodied the best of what they aspired to be. Some asked him about medals, about missions. Hale never bragged. Instead, he shared lessons. Engines break. Plans fail. Fear sets in. But as long as you remember who you're serving, not yourself, but the soldier beside you, you'll find a way forward. It was emotional storytelling at its finest, not through crafted speeches but through lived experience. And it touched every ear that heard it. Days later, the rescued unit visited the base to thank their saviors. The moment they saw Hale, bandaged soldiers pushed themselves upright to salute. One of them, a young private whose life had been hanging by a thread, looked Hale in the eye. "Sir, I'll tell my kids one day that a real war hero saved me." Hale only placed a hand on his shoulder and said softly, "Don't tell them about me." Tell them about your brothers who fought beside you. Tell them about soldier sacrifice, about the courage that kept you all alive. That's the story worth remembering. But of course, they would remember him. He had walked into their lives as a forgotten hero, and now he had become a legend whispered with reverence. Before long, the base commander organized an impromptu ceremony. It wasn't grand, no cameras, no flashing medals, just soldiers gathered under the open sky, standing at attention as the general spoke. "This is not an award," Matthews said, holding out a simple plaque. "It is a tribute. A military tribute to a man who reminds us that titles fade, but service never does. Sergeant Thomas Hale has shown us all that real war heroes aren't just written about in history books. Sometimes, they walk among us quietly, until the moment they are needed most." The applause was steady, respectful. Not the roaring kind given to celebrities, but the deep, heartfelt kind that rises from gratitude. Hale accepted the plaque, though he seemed almost embarrassed by it. "I didn't do this alone," he said. "This helicopter, this crew, this base, we all carried the weight together." Yet even as he tried to share the credit, everyone knew the truth. Without him, none of it would have been possible. In the days that followed, the young mechanics sought him out. They wanted to learn, not just the technical skills, but the wisdom behind them. Hale would walk the hangar with them, teaching not from books but from stories. Lessons about listening to machines, about respecting every part, about understanding that even the smallest component could mean the difference between life and loss. "Don't just fix," he told them. "Care. Care for the bird, care for the soldier depending on it. That's how you honor the uniform you wear." And in their eager faces, Hale saw the future. He knew his time on the battlefield was done, but the legacy of what he taught would carry forward in these young men and women. His knowledge would not be lost. It would echo through every flight, every mission, every soldier saved. The general, watching from afar, reflected quietly. "This is why we must never forget our veterans. Because they carry wisdom no manual can teach, and courage no machine can replace." On his final night at the base, as Hale prepared to leave, dozens of soldiers gathered at the airfield. They didn't cheer, they didn't shout. Instead, as he walked past, they raised their hands in salute. Row after row, young and old, their eyes shining with gratitude. It was silent, powerful, unforgettable. For Hale, it was overwhelming. He paused, looked around at the sea of faces, and for the first time allowed a small, humble smile. He had spent his life in service, often unseen, often unrecognized. But now, standing beneath the stars with salutes surrounding him, he knew his sacrifices had never been in vain. That night, the base wasn't just honoring a man. It was honoring every forgotten hero who had ever served without recognition, every unsung veteran whose quiet acts of courage had built the foundation of freedom. And as Sergeant Thomas Hale climbed into the truck that would take him home, the general's voice carried across the airfield, "Once a soldier, always a soldier. And this base will never forget what you gave us." The engine rumbled, the truck rolled forward, and Hale disappeared into the night. But his story remained, etched in the hearts of those who had witnessed it.